Hello everyone, welcome to my channel, and thanks for tuning in today. This is an educational channel. We try to focus on theories of everything, all-encompassing theories that would, revolutionize your life, that would turn everything upside down. Grand unified theories, tour de forces, magnum opuses, earth-shattering discoveries. Mostly obscure, from sources, mainly individuals who spent their whole life working on something, but never really got any credit for their efforts. But in my opinion, they hit a home run. And so I'm trying to share these things so that you might have a better fortune with your quest for better spiritual, mental, physical health, your paradigm shifting, your formation of a holistic worldview. And today is our 6th video that we've done on the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception. And this is by B. Agent and Lee, and it came out in 1991, and it's a tale of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered by a Bedouin in 1947 in the desert near a place called Qumran, which is about 20 miles from Jerusalem, and pretty much the lowest altitude place on earth. And they were discovered, but then Israel became a country the next year, and they were discovered, and some of them were on the Jordanian side of the border, and some have been on the Israeli side. And then the 6-Day War happened later on, 20 years later, and then the Israelis got their grasp on all of them. But, for 20 years, more than 20 years, really 40 years, these things were not translated and shared with the public, and still today haven't really, added up to much in terms of what the laity have learned from these. Because of the, dawdling that this international group of scholars, but mostly Dominican priests, were tasked to, decipher all of these scrolls and write books about them. And hardly any of them ever finished their books. And eventually, as we'll learn, they eventually kind of democratized the procedure. And some things have come out, some things still haven't come out. But one other aspect is that all of the Old Testament books, except for, I think, Esther, possibly Nehemiah, are part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's considered to be the important part of the find. But it isn't, because those Old Testament copies are very, very close to the so-called originals, the canonized version, but there's a lot of other stuff, what they call sectarian material, which describes this sect at Qumran, and what they were all about, what they were doing, what this meant to them, what their procedures were, what their, spiritual beliefs and rituals, and how the whole community was operated. And when you look at that, you see a lot of language that is very, very very similar to stuff that's going on in the Gospels. So anyway, we just got done talking about how Father DeVoe, who's kind of like in charge of the international team for deciphering the scrolls, actually attempted to bequeath his share of the scrolls to his research assistant, or whoever his the guy under him. And from a legal point of view, it was, to say the least, extremely irregular. More extraordinary still, however, the scholarly world did not contest this transaction. When we asked Professor Golb of the University of Chicago why so dubious a procedure was allowed to occur, he replied that opposing it would have been a lost cause. With DeVoe's behavior as a precedent, other members of his team followed suit. Thus, for example, when Father Patrick Skehan died in 1980, he bequeathed rights to the scrolls in his custody to Professor Eugene Ulrich of Notre Dame University. The scrolls had been the preserve of Father Jean Starkey, were similarly bequeathed, or more euphemistically reassigned, to Father Émile Puech of the École Biblique. Thus, the Catholic scholars at the core of the international team maintained their monopoly and control, and the consensus remained unchallenged. Not until 1987, on the death of Father Benoit, were their methods to be contested. That's 40 years after the scrolls were discovered. They were still playing, patty cake with the evidence. When Father Benoit died, Professor John Strunel was designated his successor as head of the international team. Born in Barnet, North London, in 1930, Strunel received his BA in 1952 and his MA in 1955, both from Jesus College, Oxford. Although admitted to the PhD program in Oxford's Faculty of Oriental Studies, he never completed his doctorate, and his candidature lapsed in 1958. He had been admitted, must be a typo, he had been admitted to DeVoe's team, if he had been admitted to DeVoe's team, had gone to Jerusalem and remained there for 2 years. If not right either. In 1957, after a brief stint at the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, he returned to Jerusalem, becoming affiliated with the Rockefeller Museum, where he worked as an epigraphist until 1960. In that year, he was appointed assistant professor of Old Testament studies at Duke Divinity School. In 1968, he moved to Harvard Divinity School as professor of Christian origins. Strunel's, and this guy still, he doesn't even have a PhD. That's how you know all this stuff is just a racket, If you're going to do what they want you to do, they'll bend over backwards to get you in, regardless of if you have the qualifications or not. Strunel's appointment as head of the international team, was not entirely unimpeded. Since 1967, the Israeli government had been legally authorized to ratify all such appointments. In Father Benoit's case, the Israelis hadn't bothered to exercise their authority. In Strunel's, for the first time, they asserted their own rights over the material. According to Professor Shemaryahu Talman, a member of the committee that vetted Strunel, his appointment was not ratified until certain conditions were met. Among other things, the Israelis were troubled by the way in which certain members of the international team tended to play the role of absentee landlord. Since the 1967 war, for example, Father Starkey had refused to set foot in Israel. Father Malik, DeVoe's closest confidant and protege, had for many years lived in Paris with photographs of some of the most vital scroll material to which he alone has access. No one else is allowed to make photographs. Without Malik's consent, no one, not even on the international team, is allowed to publish on the material of which he has custody. To our knowledge, he has never, since the 1967 war, returned to Jerusalem to work on this material. Time magazine describes him as elusive. Another publication, Biblical Archaeology Review, has twice reported that he refuses even to answer letters from the Israeli Department of Antiquities. He has treated both other scholars and the general public with what can only be described as disdain. I mean, it's even worse. This is these are important documents, and he's just saying, no, nobody can see these. This is in the possession of me and me only on earth. None of the other billions of you get to look at this. Even though I don't have any, this isn't mine in any, in any sense of the word. I didn't discover them. I didn't deserve to even be shown them, except for the fact that I am the protege and will follow the orders of the guy in charge. Anxious to discourage such behavior, the Israelis insisted that the new director of the Scroll Project spend at least some of his time in Jerusalem. Struniel, who was reconsidering his position at Harvard in any case, complied by taking half retirement from his post. He began to spend half of each year in Jerusalem at the École Biblique, where he had his own quarters. But there were other obligations which he failed to discharge. He did not publish the texts entrusted to him. His commentary on one of these texts, a fragment of 121 lines, it's like 3 pages, has been expected for more than 5 years, and he still has not appeared, and has still not appeared. He wrote only one 27-page article on the material in his possession. Apart from this, he published an article on Samaritan inscriptions, a translation of Malik's study of the Qumran, and, as we shall see, a long and hostile critique of the one member of the international team to challenge the interpretation of the consensus. It is not a very impressive record for a man who spent a lifetime working in a field which depends on publication. On the other hand, he allowed selected graduate students to work on certain original texts for their doctoral degrees, thus earning prestige for them, for their mentor, and for Harvard. This guy doesn't even have a PhD himself, and he has spent more time trying to debunk one of the other people who actually wrote on his portion of the scrolls, and he spent more time trying to debunk that interpretation than he did in trying to positively write about his, responsibility. In general, under Struniel's auspices, the international team proceeded pretty much as they did before. It is interesting to compare their progress with that of scholars working on a different corpus of texts, the so-called Gnostic Gospels discovered in Egypt at Nag Hammadi. Now, this is interesting because this author here compares the Nag Hammadi text with the Dead Sea Scrolls to show how the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was smooth, a smooth translation, and they were out in available to the public, in a reasonable amount of time, while the Dead Sea Scrolls languished in, the bank vaults and stuff like that. But if you look at Elaine Pagels' book on the Gnostic Gospels, she kind of says the opposite. So could be a grass is always greener kind of thing. In both cases, it took quite a while before they were published. I know it's a big job, especially the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a lot more in the Dead Sea Scrolls than there are in the Nag Hammadi. But there's probably a lot more unseen material among the Nag Hammadi. So, okay, the Nag Hammadi scrolls were found 2 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1945. By 1948, they had all been purchased by the Cairo Coptic Museum. There was initially an attempt to establish a Qumran-style monopoly over the material, again by an enclave of French scholars. And as a result, work on them was retarded until 1956. No sooner did it finally get underway than it was interrupted by the Suez Crisis. After this delay, however, the scrolls were in 1966 turned over to an international team of scholars for translation and publication. The head of this team was Professor James Robinson of the Institute for Antiquity and Christianity at Claremont Graduate School, California. When we spoke to Professor Robinson about the team in charge of Qumran texts, he was scathing. The Qumran scholars, Professor Robinson said, no longer have to make reputations. All they can do is break them. Professor Robinson and his team, in contrast, moved with impressive rapidity. Within 3 years, a number of draft transcriptions and translations were being made available to scholars. By 1973, the entire Nag Hammadi library was in draft English translation and was circulating freely amongst interested researchers. In 1977, the whole body of the Nag Hammadi codices was published in facsimile and a popular edition. A total of 46 books plus some unidentified fragments. It thus took Robinson and his team a mere 11 years to bring the Nag Hammadi scrolls into print. 11 years, I would say, is not too bad, but it took them 20 years to get them into Robinson's hands. So we're still talking about 32 years from discovery to public access, full public access. So that's still 32 years. That seems, that seems a bit long, especially if you were like a biblical scholar and you were salivating to get your hands on these things and you just had to wait for like half your life, half your adult life to see them. By the time you see them, you're already, about to retire. Okay, granted, the Qumran texts were more numerous and posed more complex problems than those from Nag Hammadi. But even allowing for this, the record of DeVoe's international team does not exactly inspire confidence. When they were formed in 1953, their declared objective and intention was to publish all the scrolls found at Qumran in definitive editions, forming a series to be issued by Oxford University Press as Discoveries in the Judean Desert of Jordan. The first volume appeared quickly enough in 1955 and dealt with the fragments found in the original cave at Qumran, now officially designated Cave 1. Not until 1961, 6 years later, did the next volume appear, and this did not deal with Qumran texts at all, but with material found in the nearby caves of Muraba'at. In 1963, a third volume appeared, which dealt primarily with scroll fragments from Cave 2, Cave 3, and Caves 5 through 10. Of these fragments, the most complete and important was the copper scroll, found in Cave 3. Apart from the copper scroll, the lengthiest text amounted to just over 60 lines. and most came to something between 4 and 12 lines. But the fragments also yielded 2 copies of a text known as the Book of Jubilees. A copy of the same text would later be found at Masada, revealing that the defenders of the fortress used the same calendar as the Qumran community, and establishing closer connections between the 2 sites than DeVoe felt comfortable acknowledging. The 4th volume of Discoveries in the Judean Desert appeared in 1965 under the editorship of James A. Sanders. But Professor Sanders was not a member of DeVoe's team. The scroll he dealt with, a volume of Psalms, had been found by the Bedouin in Cave 11 by 1956 and brought along with a number of fragments to the Rockefeller Museum. No purchaser being forthcoming, the material was locked in one of the museum's safes, to which no one was allowed access. Here it remained until 1961, when the Albright Institute was at last enabled to buy it. Finance being provided by Kenneth and Elizabeth Bechtel of the Bechtel Corporation, a giant American construction company. I thought they did, could be wrong. I thought they did munitions also. But anyway, with many interests in the Middle East, though none in Israel, many connections with the American government, and at least some associations with the CIA. Professor Sanders' volume thus appeared independently of the framework and timetable established by DeVoe's international team. In the meantime, however, the bulk of the most copious and most significant material, the material found in the veritable treasure trove of Cave 4, continued to be withheld from both the public and the academic community. Now and again, small pieces and tantalizing fragments would leak into scholarly journals. But not until 1968 did the first official publication of material from Cave 4, albeit a very small proportion, appear. It did so under the auspices of the one renegade or heretic on DeVoe's team, John Allegro. As delays in releasing the Qumran material persisted, and the time between published volumes continued to lengthen, suspicions began to proliferate that something was seriously amiss. Critics voiced 3 suspicions in particular. It was suggested that DeVoe's team were finding their material too difficult, too complex. It was also suggested that they might deliberately be proceeding slowly, suppressing or at least retarding the release of certain material in order to buy time. And it was suggested that the team were simply lazy and idle, basking in comfortable sinecures, which they would obviously be in no hurry to relinquish. It was further pointed out that no such delays had occurred with the pieces of Qumran material in American and Israeli hands. In contrast to DeVoe's team, American and Israeli scholars had wasted no time in bringing their material into print. The 6th volume of Discoveries in the Judean Desert did not appear until 1977, 9 years after Allegro's work. A 7th volume was not issued until 1982, an 8th only in 1990, and this latter did not deal with the Qumran texts. As we have noted, draft translations of Nag Hammadi codices were in circulation within 3 years. In the case of the Qumran material, no such draft translations were ever made available by DeVoe's team, nor are they so today. This book was written in 1991, so I believe everything is out there now, or destroyed, or hidden. So the entire Nag Hammadi corpus was in print within 11 years. It is now approaching 38 years since DeVoe's team began their work, and they have so far produced only 8 volumes, less than 25% of the material in their hands. As we shall see, moreover, of the material which has appeared in print, very little of it is the material that really matters. In an interview published in the New York Times, Robert Eisenman spoke of how a small circle of scholars has been able to dominate a field of research for several generations, even though some of these scholars have been defunct in this field for years, and to continue to do so through their control of graduate studies and placing their coterie of students and scholars in the most prestigious academic chairs. Biblical Archaeological Review, an influential journal published by the Washington lawyer Herschel Shanks, described DeVoe's international team as being governed, quote, governed so far as can be ascertained, largely by convention, tradition, collegiality, and inertia. According to the BAR, the insiders who hold the scrolls have the goodies to drip out bit by bit. This gives them status, scholarly power, and a wonderful ego trip. Why squander it? And at a conference on the scrolls at New York University in 1985, Professor Morton Smith, one of the most distinguished names in contemporary biblical studies, began by saying scathingly, "I thought to speak on the scandals of the Dead Sea documents, but these proved too numerous, too familiar, and too disgusting." How have the members of the international team responded to such damning condemnation? Of the original international team assembled in 1953, only 3 at present remain alive. Again, this is in 1991. Joseph Malik, who has since left the priesthood, maintains, as we have seen, the life of an elusive recluse in Paris. Professors John Struniel and Frank Cross were at Harvard Divinity School. Of these, Professor Cross proved the most accessible and allowed himself to be questioned about the delays in publication. In an interview with the New York Times, he admitted that progress had generally been slow and offered 2 explanations. Most members of the team, he said, were engaged in full-time teaching and could get to Jerusalem to work on the material only during summer holidays. And the scrolls that have not yet been published, he added, are so fragmented that it is difficult to fit them together, much less translate them. It's the, quote, "It's the world's most fantastic jigsaw puzzle," he remarked on another occasion. It would, of course, be rash to underestimate the complexity of the work in which Cross and his colleagues were engaged. The myriad fragments of Qumran text do indeed constitute a daunting jigsaw puzzle. Nevertheless, Cross's explanations are not altogether convincing. It is certainly true that members of the international team are active in teaching and have only limited time to spend in Jerusalem. But Cross did not mention that most of the work now being done on the scrolls is done with photographs, which do not require the researcher to travel anywhere. In fact, the state of photography at present often makes it easier and more reliable to deal with the photographs than with original parchments. As for the complexity of the jigsaw, Cross himself contradicted his own argument. As early as 1958, he wrote that most of the scroll fragments then in the team's hands had already been identified. In fact, by the summer of 1956. According to John Allegro, writing in 1964, assembly and identification of all Cave 4 material, the most copious corpus, was nearly complete by 1960 or 61. Nor was the task of identifying material always as difficult as Cross might lead one to believe. In a letter to John Allegro, dated December 13, 1955, Struniel wrote that 3,000 pounds worth of Cave 4 material had just been purchased with Vatican funds and identified in one afternoon. Complete photographs of the material, he added, would require no more than a week. Even before he breached the consensus of the international team, Allegro was anxious to speed things up and skeptical of the various reasons proffered for not doing so. But was it merely as a sop that DeVoe wrote to him in March of 1959 that all the Qumran texts would be published and discoveries in the Judean desert complete by the middle of 1962? The date scheduled for Struniel's concluding volume? In the same letter, DeVoe stated that work on the original text would be finished by June of 1960, after which they would be turned over to the various institutions that had paid for them. Today, more than 30 years after DeVoe's letter, survivors of his team and its new members still cling to the scrolls in their possession, insisting on the need for continued research. And it's worth repeating, what has been voluntarily released is, for the most part, of the least importance. Okay, we're going to stop right there. This kind of stuff really kind of gets me a little bit angry because, you know, this is just a waste here, what these people are doing. A big waste of time. And, you know, I have issues with people when they choose ignorance over, you know, making an attempt to learn something. So we will probably encounter a lot more of that in tomorrow's episode. Thanks for tuning in today, and hope to see you here tomorrow. Have a great day.